reminder, I'm just going to type in to the chat right now some of the verses that we're going to be talking on and around. So if you want to make a reference to this, it's going to pop up here in the chat. We've got quite a bit. These are all the ones that Pastor Dustin was mentioning in his sermon today and then surrounding. This is from Mark chapter 8. Terrific. Okay, well, we might have a few friends that pop in and join us, but I want to get us jumped into our conversation here. So our goal for this space, as part of our community's practice of observing Lent this time around, and really focusing in on the person of Jesus as he journeys towards the cross, is we want to have a space where we can continue conversation on these life-giving stories that we're having, that we're talking about and we're preaching through on Sunday morning. So to do that, we have, of course, Pastor Dustin, who brought us a really wonderful word this morning with a lot to talk about there. And then our dear friend, Tim Getter, who is sort of familiar with Mark in a couple of different languages, at least. And we were going to, exactly, it is such a good commentary, one of my favorites to actually read. So we're excited. I know that Dustin and I in the past have both shared conversation on Mark with Tim, as have many of you, and we want to kind of continue that this morning. So to jump right in, no question is off limits. Please do bring us whatever it is on your mind, whether it's something that we could clear up in terms of just a basic what about this or that, or something that you're wondering on. But to jump right in, Tim and Dustin, we just jumped right midway, literally, into this story that Mark is telling of Jesus. So we just jumped dead into the middle of it. Could you guys perhaps give us a sense of what has been happening in Mark? How does this story fit into the larger structure? What does it mean that, like Dustin said, it's a hinge text at the very middle? We don't watch movies and just go to pause at the very middle timer mark to say, oh, well, this must be important. But it seems that Dustin was suggesting there might be something happening with that. So, Tim, could you tell us, how does this text sort of fit into what Mark is doing in telling this Jesus story?
Sure. So I think Dustin's absolutely right that this is kind of a hinge. There's more than one hinge in Mark, but this is probably the main one. This is the midpoint where, in one sense, everything shifts. Almost everything up to this point is what we would normally say is all good news. Like Jesus is going around announcing that the kingdom of God is arriving. Jesus is healing people. Like everybody who reads that first half is going to say, wow, this is great stuff. I'm really looking forward to how it's all going to end. Now, there's a couple of ominous lines already in the first half, however, that suggests that that's not the whole story. So a couple of weeks ago, I actually preached about a Greek word, paradidomi. You get this pattern in Mark where you get glimpses of the fact that somebody's going to be handing Jesus over and it's not going to end well. Like you get these glimpses in the first half already, but nothing where the story is told. It's only sort of alluded to. And so you almost have to sympathize with the disciples by the middle of the book if they have the feeling that, this is all going to be a great, wonderful, happy ending. We'll all live happily ever after. And Jesus, right in the middle, says, okay, there's another half of this story. And it's not that Jesus ever removes all the expectation of a wonderful ending. It's just this wonderful ending isn't all going to happen in a straight line in the middle of life. It's some of it be after a resurrection. And so, yeah, the journey to the cross is that center point.
Okay, so I want to pick up on that in a little bit, how Jesus mixes the good and the bad here in kind of an interesting way. We can sort of lose sight of one for the other. Pastor Dustin, Tim just told us that the first half of Mark, these first 8 chapters are full of life. So since we want to be talking about life, why didn't we just talk about the first 8 chapters of Mark? Why is it that for Lent we're saying we're sticking with this kind of dark theme and not just focusing on the good alone? What is it we're trying to embrace during this life before death series that we're embarking on together?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Why not just highlight the feeding of the 4,000 is right before this story, and the feeding of the 5,000 right before that. Some pretty cool healing stories happen, and we could focus on those things, but I think the reason why we sensed that focusing on the second half was important was it, and I think Tim just said it well, like the shadow of the cross extends all the way to the beginning of the gospel. It's not absent. It doesn't just show up right here in chapter 8, but it does move more prominently into focus. And I think that it brings to mind the imagery of Psalm 23, that it feels like we're living in this valley of the shadow of death. Jesus brings our imagination to that place, and saying we're going to be making this long descent to the cross, and things are going to get, conflict is going to be more active now. And by looking at these particular stories, they help us kind of bring what the cross is and does and accomplishes. And I should say, and Tim has well, in his commentary, he writes this, which reminded me of what I've heard him say before, which is that when Jesus talks about his crucifixion, he doesn't just talk about his crucifixion alone. It's always like hyphenated, crucifixion and resurrection. They're always, these two things are always coming together. And so I think this is our way of focusing and keeping those two things together, that the resurrection life that comes through the cross is also coming through the cross and happening and bringing us towards it and then through it. So
that's strong, and that reminds me very much of Tim teaching us to bring those two themes together. So maybe we'll get back to that. But Tim, Dustin mentioned a little bit about geography. We're told where this place is. We know very quickly where the destination is. So could you tell us a little bit about what might be the significance that this place is named? What is this place known for, that this exchange takes place in the midst of? And then for us, thinking about that place, I mean, is there any contemporary places we could think of that would bring up similar themes in our lives today? Anything on this setting?
Sure. This is where I'd be tempted to ask Jenny to help fill in the details, because she and I stood side by side looking at a big wall in Caesarea Philippi, about and a few other North Fresno people as well. So Caesarea Philippi is the far north, and Jerusalem is the far south. So that's the first significant. It's a journey. It's a long journey. But think of the name, Caesarea, that has the word Caesar in it. And Philip was one of the Roman officials after whom this city was named. Like this is an empire city. This is a city dedicated to, named for, and devoted to the Roman Empire. And there was a ton of pagan worship going on there. And wherever the Roman Empire exerted its influence, there was also the declaration that Caesar is Lord, and that ultimately the empire rules. And so at precisely this place, Jesus says the kingdom belongs to God, and the Lord is Jesus. And so the journey to the cross is also a journey away from the center of worldly power, and then in Jerusalem, also away from the center of religious power to the power of love and the power of redemption and the power of resurrection and so on. So there's all sorts of associations with Caesarea Philippi that make it particularly important that Jesus uses that as the occasion to say, okay, we're going on a different journey than some of you are expecting.
Wonderful. Really, really helpful. And so, Dustin, this starts one of the other details that we get at the beginning of the part of the text that you were beginning to talk about is that there's some other guesses as to who Jesus would be that are floating around in the air, right? Before Peter's confession and the words we're going to be sort of contemplating this week. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Who are these figures? What are sort of some of the expectations that seem to be part of the conversation surrounding the Son of Man and his identity?
Well, yeah, I think from what I know of these figures from the biblical narrative, I mean, obviously Mark introduces us to John the Baptist, baptizer, pretty early on and pretty prominently, and I go back 3 weeks and listen to Tim's sermon on what happens to John the Baptizer. But then, so there's John the Baptist, then there's Elijah, who is one of Israel's foremost prophets and is the one whom doesn't die. There's this kind of strange thing where he's escorted in pretty dramatic fashion. Chariots of Fire. That's where that movie or hymn, depending on your generation, comes from. But yet there were expectations around Elijah being the one to, since he, I was going to say died in the way that he did, but he didn't really die. Since he left the stage in the way that he did, there was this expectation that he would return, and that would be the inauguration of the kingdom. Or another one of the prophets, one of Israel's faithful people, but who provide this minority report, speaking out against the things that Tim has just talked about being true of Caesarea Philippi. The prophets were saying, actually, Israel has become those things. The people of God have pursued those things, and they were calling Israel back to faithfulness in God. So those are sort of the options that Peter and the people around were saying. Jesus is kind of like these figures, and yet Jesus. But the thing that resonated with me as I was studying this week and praying through this was Jesus, in the way that Jesus does, meets those expectations. He doesn't say, no, wrong. I'm not that. Jesus fulfills the longing and the expectation of what's in each of those figures. Jesus is the fullness of what John the Baptizer was, except he baptizes with the Holy Spirit, not just with water. He's the miracle working prophet who, like Elijah, can bring the dead back to life, but to resurrection life, not to temporary life. He is the prophet. He is the minority report, the one crying out in the wilderness, saying, "Return to your first love." And but it just looks different than anyone sort of expected it to look.
Yeah. So yeah, Tim, you want to follow up on that?
For comment, these people think that they're giving Jesus the highest possible acclaim when they say John the Baptist, because we already read in chapter 6 in Mark that the only way he could be John the Baptist is if he came back to life again.
Wow.
And it was widely believed that the voice of prophecy had kind of been silent for 400 years. So to say, no, you are a prophet, or you are John the Baptist, or it's like they think they're giving him the highest possible acclaim that they can imagine. And then the same thing happens the very next incident on the Mountain of Transfiguration. So Elijah and Moses show up, and the disciples are so amazed. They say, wow, he's just as great as Elijah and Moses.
Right.
And the whole point of that story is actually he's a whole lot greater than, like, you can't ever overestimate the greatness of Jesus.
Wow.
You can raise him as high as you think you can, and it's never going to get to what Jesus really is. So,
Wow.
so when Peter does even one better, not just a prophet, not just John the Baptist, not just Elijah, he's the Messiah. He thinks that's as high as you can get, but he doesn't get it. He doesn't quite understand Messiah yet. So the paradox is that you can raise Jesus as high as you want, you never get it high enough, and yet he goes to the cross. It's like you're supposed to get him higher or lower. And the paradox is that he lowers himself to the place of the servant and the sacrifice. But we raise Jesus.
Wow. So we're going to be dwelling on some of these words this week. You are the Christ, this foundational turning point of a confession. So obviously the word there, many of us are church people, and we have a sense of what Messiah means. We at least know, it's like, oh, Messiah, that's Jesus Christ, but, or Jesus the Christ. But what might we be missing as we reflect this week on what this confession means, seemingly to the disciples, to Jesus, to the larger culture and society and expectations? Could you give us some things to hang on to as we sit with the text this week? And just one, as you do, a reminder that because this is a webinar, the 3 of our videos are on, and so the way to get questions in is to type them into the chat, and then we can see them. So Zoom isn't going to turn on your videos right now. Nobody's looking at you. We get all of your visual attention. So we're the guinea pigs for this, but you can absolutely communicate with us, and we hope that you'll get in some questions. But back to you, Tim, on what this term Messiah means.
Sure. So I sometimes tell my students that when we use the word Messiah, we think we're using an English term, but it's actually a Hebrew term. Now it's more like Mashiach in Hebrew. So when we say Messiah, we're just badly pronouncing our Hebrew. But when we say Christ, that's not an English word either. We're just badly pronouncing our Greek, because the Greek word is Christos, and so we get the word Christ from it. So there's nothing wrong with that. Like, Messiah is sort of the Hebrew way, and Christ is sort of the English way. But both of these words had a very specific meaning in those languages. So if you said Mashiach in Hebrew, everyone would know that you mean anointed. That's what the word means. If you said Christos in Greek, everyone knows that you mean anointed, because that's what the word means. So if we wanted to, we could just swap in the word anointed. It wouldn't really help us that much more, because we'd still say, what does that mean? And anointed for what? And so in the Old Testament, people would be anointed to be a priest. They'd be anointed to be a king. And anointed kind of came to mean, a specially designated person called out by God for a unique and specific role. And so throughout the Old Testament, this word anointed shows up in some pretty significant places as, God's primary representative, or God's primary way of acting in the world. Psalm 2 is the clearest example of that, and the early church quoted Psalm 2 at length. Psalm 2 talks about Yahweh the Lord and his Mashiach, his anointed, who then later in the same psalm is called the Son. You are my Son. So these words all have multiple connotations, but we should think of it as the one who comes to completely fulfill what God designated him to do. Now, when we say that, the one thing that always makes me a little bit nervous is we think the only Old Testament promise is that God's going to send someone. God's going to send a Messiah. God's going to send a king. But even more frequently, for example, in Isaiah, it's not about God sending. It's about God showing up. It's about God coming. And so Jesus is simultaneously sent by God, but Jesus is at the very same time how God decided to show up in person. And so even though the New Testament isn't really clear on exactly how the Trinity works, it kind of gets worked out, especially in the Gospel of John. The Father sends the Son, but both of them are God. Like, there's one God, and when Jesus is on earth, he's not just the Messiah. He's God, God in the flesh. So he's the fully designated perfect human who carries out God's will, but he's also God. And that's kind of the paradox of it. type of faith.
Yeah, Dustin, I loved how in the sermon you were showing some of this exact Christology that Dr. Geddert's talking about right now when you were talking about the image of God that we get. Good theology is incarnation, right? Is Jesus showing up in this particular way, and that somehow there's a revelation of that in this text, and then we're also suggesting perhaps something that we're learning during COVID. But Tim is talking specifically about this idea of anointing the Messiah, this character that's specifically designated. But there's this other character here in the text in Peter. We didn't get as much of a chance to talk about him personally today, but talk to us a little bit about how Peter is in this story in Mark, and then how Peter shows up very famously, for those of us from different branches of the church, maybe even more so, in the Gospel of Matthew. Why does he show up? Same story in some ways, but a little bit different. Talk to us about that.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting to me about Peter, that was just sort of in the back of my mind this week, is and Tim, I forget your perspective on this, about Mark using Peter as some source material for the gospel. Peter's telling of the story becomes interwoven with the way that Mark has his narrator tell the story.
Mhm.
But I think it's we're clued in. Mark 1:1, this is the beginning of the good news, Jesus, the Son of God. Like we know how the story ends. And so we're tempted into what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, where we think like, oh, how silly of Peter, how did he not get it? Like he just calmed the wind and the waves on the sea. Like obviously he is Yahweh incarnate. Well, it's not that clear and easy, and obviously the next 8 chapters are going to bear out the ways that Peter continues to fumble his way into faithfulness. And so if Mark is telling this story from Peter's perspective, at least at some level, like Peter includes his failure here. Peter includes his bravado, his very human desire to play consultant to God, and I think that's part of what Jesus graciously frees us from in this passage, but also something that we experience as we engage with God in this particular form of prayer and centering prayer, is that we are reminded of our place in the universe, and that there is a place for us. It's just not as the Messiah, and that our humility, our failure, our bad theology can all get. That's the stuff that God uses to, and that God uses very patiently to form us more into people who are following Jesus. Yeah, and I think just to put a cherry on top of that, I think Peter tells it this way, or Mark has it told this way from Peter's perspective, perhaps, because if the goal of faith, if obedience is something that we have to do for God to say like good job, then Peter wouldn't include this story. But if attempting to be obedient in response to who God is the point, then Peter has every reason to include and tell this story, because that's what we're all trying to do. And thank God for Jesus, who can help us live more obediently.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit of a change of pace here because we're getting our first questions coming through. So I think our other panelists could see it. I'll just read it out for the room. Larry, Kathleen, Dwight, and Laurelyn ask this. It seems like Mark tells the story of Jesus at a very fast pace, right? Especially early on. What might he be attempting to accomplish by doing it this way? Or is this just his personality, right? Is this his authorial style? Is this, what would you say, Tim, having sat with Mark, what could you say about his pacing?
So first of all, let me completely affirm that that's the first impression that we get. There's a little word in Greek called euthus, two spellings, euthus or euthios. It shows up 85 times in the New Testament, and over half are in Mark. Shortest gospel, and this word immediately shows up, and it's almost all in the first 8 chapters. Like it's, if you look for the English translation, you wouldn't find nearly all of them because English translators just wouldn't ever put the same word in that often. So the English translation will say immediately, and then right away, and then very shortly after that, and then immediately again. Like it's just all over the place. However, that led a whole generation of scholars to think that Mark doesn't really care about pondering and about thinking deeply and about looking for layers of meaning. He just wants to run this PowerPoint at triple speed and give this glimpse and this overall impression. And in the last 40 years or so, scholars have said, whoa, we're missing almost everything in Mark if all we do is rush from scene to scene and imagine that that's all Mark has in mind. And so there's a whole new way of reading Mark that pauses, that reflects on the wording. Tried to do that a couple of weeks ago with paradidomi, that reflects on the sequences. Why does this event happen right here? And why does this one come right before it? Why does this one come right after it? And Dustin mentioned a few of those today. And so I don't know why Mark uses this word immediately all the time, but if anything, I would caution people against reaching the conclusion that the only thing he wants us to do is rush through it. He wants us to pause and reflect. Yeah, that would be a few thoughts.
Okay, here's a very pastoral question. Thank you for that one. It highlights a significant sort of defining part of the way that Mark shares this story. Now we're getting a question about the last verse, which is above in the chat, verse number 38. We didn't really get to this one in today's sermon, so throw it out there for comments to both Dustin and Tim. Here's the question. The last verse talks about shame, and it doesn't really connect with my view of God. As a father that may be disappointed, but not ashamed of his children. This is, I believe, coming from Matt Ford. Can we really do something to make God ashamed of us? I wonder about the translation of that word. Again, the verse is this. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Dustin and Tim, what are some thoughts on this word?
Well, I'll jump in first in saying that this sort of chunk of the story really begins as a chunk with Peter's confession and then ends with the verse after this that is that in our Bibles is chapter 9 verse 1. But in order to address these last two, that's a different sermon. So I just kind of narrowed our focus here a little bit for the morning. But it as far as my reflexive reactions to this is that at least biblically, shame functioned differently and does function differently in Eastern cultures than it does in Western cultures. There's overlap there for sure, but there are different nuances in Western culture. We tend to internalize shame as something that says you are not enough. And if that's the case, then it wouldn't be very loving of God to shame us, to remind us, to rub our noses in the fact that you are not enough. That's not quite helpful, and it doesn't align with the view of God. So your intuition is right there. However, in Eastern cultures, shame is used in constructive ways. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 talks about the cross being the thing that God uses to shame the wise. It's the foolishness of the world, but used to shame the wisdom of the world in a way that isn't to flap God's nose at people per se, but is used in a constructive way to expose the folly of something in order to win something back. More akin to, I would ponder that perhaps the father in the prodigal son story allows both of the sons to experience constructive shaming in order for both of them to return to his heart. And that's what my initial thought on that. Tim, is there anything specific about the word that would nuance that in any way?
I don't think
the
so.
Greek word, I mean.
First of all, I would agree with you on that. Whenever God declares us to be guilty, it's also not in order to figure out why God could be able to condemn us. It's rather to lead us back to repentance and lead us back into confession and forgiveness. In other words, a declaration of guilt is a means of redemption. And so a shame would be the same thing, especially the way you described it in Eastern culture. It's like, unless we realize that we have somehow fallen short of the glory of God, what would motivate us to want to turn back and be transformed? And this whole section has a lot to do with, like, Peter turned in the wrong direction when he rebuked Jesus, and so Jesus wants to turn him back in the right direction. It seems a little bit of an event when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Like, that's pretty harsh, but let's remember, get behind me, it means go back into the posture of a disciple who's supposed to be behind Jesus, follow. It's not just a put down, it's rather being put back in the proper place. Get back in line.
That's so good.
When we're shamed, we are aware that we've fallen short of God's glory, so that we can make the necessary adjustments back. And I would say this whole passage, we often read it negatively. You got to give up this, and you have to do this because this is what it means. You got to give things up. But all these lines are about how you gain back. How do you save your life? Well, Jesus tells us how to save your life. How do you get honored by the Son of Man? Well, Jesus tells us how. Like, it's positive teaching, even though there's sometimes a negative side until we turn back.
Wow. Well, that one leads in. We've got some comments coming in, noticing, reminding us of the way that shame involves sort of a collective mentality, right? In this ancient time, not just an individual thing, which many of us have experiences with that are quite adverse. But we get a question from John France, and it comes with sort of a context. So I'll give this as our last question to the panelists for the day, and I think it goes into what Tim was talking about, where Peter's being put back into this place of following Jesus. John says, "We served as house parents to missionary kids in years past. Some of the missionary kids resented the perceived abandonment of their parents to serve the Lord. This was one of the verses we occasionally heard. Quoting from the passage, 'Whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it,' cited from missionary and later pastor kids as well. But what reflections do you have, both of you being pastors, fathers, about the cross-bearing and dedication to the cause of Christ alongside of loving and serving family in their interests? How do we get behind Jesus and follow him, making sacrifices that affect our families?"
Well, to comment on what the ideal would be, it should not be read as evidence that we accomplish that all the time. But I think ideally, always putting Jesus first turns out to be to the advantage and never to the disadvantage of everybody else.
Mhm.
If my wife is the most important person in my life, bar none, then I think she has it pretty good. But if she's the second most important person in my life, second only to Jesus, I think she would have it even better. I mean, I think that's the ideal. That's the goal. Same with my kids.
Mm.
If I put my kids first, they benefit. If I put Jesus first and then my kids second, they benefit even more. Because whenever Jesus is first, Jesus is the one who teaches us how to be loving and faithful and to honor the important people in our lives and our family, etc. Now, I think that's the ideal. That doesn't mean it's easy to do. There's so many situations where it's perceived that we're putting Jesus first, which ends up meaning my church job or my seminary teaching or the next meeting that prevents me from playing with my children, or like it can easily go in that direction. But the ideal is to truly understand what it means to put Jesus first for the benefit of not only my family but my neighbors, my church, this world.
Amen. Dustin, all right, you are young Beckett's dad, so you're going to have these pastor kids. What do you do when someone brings up this as a proof text of you got to lose your life to find it as a dad? How do you think about this in maintaining boundaries in your own walk as a disciple of Jesus that you were reflecting on with us this morning?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of overlap with precisely what Tim just described. One something that came to me in prayer was this idea of order of operations. I'm a terrible math person, but this was one thing that I was able to get my mind around, and I could still have it wrong. So if you are an algebra teacher or something, please correct me. But that in order to solve for something, you have to put the equation in the right order, and so the way I like to conceive of who I am as a person is in this order: a disciple, a husband, a father, and a pastor. And if any of those things are out of order, if the three things I mentioned aren't behind Jesus in the proper order, then and I think so disciple, as a result of being a disciple, I've been entrusted with three different overlapping and interlocking ministries: the ministry of marriage, the ministry of parenting, and the ministry of being a pastor. And those three things are not separate segmented things, but the way that I am a disciple overflows into my understanding of what it means to be a husband and a father and a pastor. And they're not in competition with each other. And I am constantly being put in my place by the voice of Jesus, often through Robin, often through Beckett, to remind me of the proper order of operations. That's easy for me to take any of those things, especially the pastor one, and say, well, that's why I need to pray, you are the Messiah. So I can be a pastor.
Well, friends, thank you for being part of this first ever experiment with us. I know some of us have had a hard time logging in, so to those of you who persevered through that and got here, we sure are glad that you did. We're going to be back
next week.
Next week, that's exactly right. So for those of you who are reflecting on the different sort of orders of operations, we invite your continued reflections as we together consider what it means for us as individuals and as the church to declare that Jesus is the Messiah. So a big thank you to Dr. Tim and to Pastor Dustin for a wonderful message this morning. Blessings to all of you. And if there's someone who you heard about that couldn't get in today, I think we're going to be making this recording recording available later in the week. So please join us in
Yep.
directing them there. With that, have a wonderful week, and we'll hope to see you online or next week.
Bye. Thank you.
Peace.
Thanks.